Welcome back, dear listener, or perhaps welcome for the very first time. You've arrived at the quiet hour of the nighttime historian, a place where the winds still whisper through caravan tents, where the scent of ink and spice lingers in the folds of ancient scrolls, and where stories do not gallop through time, but drift, slow as desert wind, deep as the silence of a palace at dusk. Tonight, we follow the footprints of a man who crossed the entire known world. A boy from Venice who sailed beyond the edge of certainty. A guest at the throne of the great Khan. A prisoner with a story too wide for any map and too distant for the ink of record. He told of black stones that caught fire, of cities where paper was exchanged for gold, of beasts with a single horn and rivers that healed the body. Some believed him, some did not, but all listened. This is not only the story of Marco Polo. It is the story of a tale, a journey, and the blur between memory and myth. It is a path lined with lantern light and spinning carriage wheels, and one will now begin to walk. Before we begin tonight's journey, I would ask you gently to leave a comment and share where you're listening from. Whether it's a quiet attic above a sleeping city, a ship's cabin where only the creak of timber breaks the silence, or a bed where the lights have long gone out. It is always a quiet joy to hear who travels this road with us. And if these stories linger, if they help the dark feel a little less empty, you're always welcome to return and subscribe. But only if your heart finds something true in these half-forgotten tales. So now, let your shoulders drop. Let the maps curl in your mind like old parchment. Breathe in the musk of silk bales piled in caravan wagons, the brine of a harbour at dawn, the perfume of jasmine caught in desert wind. Picture stars reflected in a cup of tea on a palace rooftop, the clatter of hooves on frozen steppe, the hush of a scribe taking dictation by candlelight. Let your thoughts wander not to destinations, but to distance, not to fact, but to wonder. This is not a tale for certainty. It is a tale for those who have ever longed for elsewhere, for those who believe that every road east leads a little deeper into the soul. So come with me now, into the long road east, into the book that changed the world, or fooled it, and into the quiet marvels of Marco Polo's memory. The prison was not loud, it breathed in its own way, slow draughts curling through rusted grates, a scrape of chain, the dry crack of old straw. Above, Genoa turned with its usual business, sails unfurling on the Ligurian sea, voices rising along alleyways slick with morning mist. But here, in the belly of stone, time thickened. The walls held heat like secrets, and in one of its quieter cells, two men shared a kind of exile. One had the hands of a knight and the patience of a poet. Rusticello of Pisa, once a soldier, now a spinner of romances. The other, darker from sun, sharper in gaze, did not look like a man made for cages. Marco Polo was in his mid-40s when he was captured in 1298 during a naval battle between Venice and Genoa. And what he carried was not a sword, but a horizon. The stories he told seemed to hang in the air after they were spoken, not dramatic, not whispered, but dense. Stories of cities carved in jade, markets that hummed with 6 languages, stone that smouldered like coal, stories that didn't quite fit inside the walls they were told within. And it didn't start with declaration or explanation, but a rhythm, the slow dip of quill into ink, the shuffle of parchment, the measured tone of a memory half held and half reshaped. Rustichello asked for dragons. Marco gave him city gates and postal routes, weights in silver and rumours on the wind. But just when the tale risked becoming ledger-like, he would shift and speak of beasts with human voices, of kings who ruled by dreams, of rivers that ran uphill. "I saw it," he said often, not to convince, but to continue. There was certainty in his retelling, and yet not closure. The kind of certainty that feels more like longing. Rustichello wrote it all, as tapestry, names skewed by distance, measurements woven into metaphor. The book that emerged, Il Milione, was not a map, but a refracted lens. A story that folded memory into myth until the difference no longer mattered. Many did not believe him, some still don't. Why no mention of tea, of temple bells, of painted scrolls? Why such detail in some corners and silence in others? Some argue he stayed in Persia and stitched a tale from caravan gossip. Others believe he did reach China, but filtered it through the eyes of a man shaped by Venetian streets. And yet, inside the marvels, there is structure. There are road systems that match Chinese records, rituals that ring true, details too odd to have been conjured. What baffles scholars is not how much he claimed, but how much he left unsaid, as if the East he carried back with him could not be described all at once, as if it had altered him in ways language could not quite contain. And so we begin, not on the Silk Road, but in a stone room where daylight never touches the floor, with a man pacing the length of his thoughts, and another capturing them before they faded. This is a story shaped less by certainty than by endurance. It has slipped through centuries like a rumour, passed from ink to parchment, from sailor to scholar. Whether Marco Polo crossed the spine of Asia on horseback, or wandered only the vast interiors of his own memory, we cannot say. But what he left behind has drawn countless others eastward, and tonight we follow that trail, not to verify, but to feel the pull of it, to walk into the heat of unfamiliar cities and the hush of impossible ones, until something ancient and unfinished stirs again. Venice did not rise, it seeped, born not on solid earth, but in salt and silt and tide. A city spun across water like lace laid atop a sleeping sea. Her buildings stood on forests buried beneath the mud, pillars of alder driven down until they hardened into permanence. From a distance she shimmered. Closer she creaked. Gondolas groaned against moorings. Flags snapped above green canals. The brine of the lagoon clung to marble steps, mingling with incense from high chapels and the iron tang of coins passing hand to hand. Venice spoke in bells, slow, deliberate, resonant, counting not just time, but arrival. Everything here flowed with movement. And in the middle of this floating world, still far from any desert or court or map, was a boy called Marco. To grow up Venetian was to breathe trade before prayer. Streets of water taught the art of waiting. Doorways led to courtyards filled with drying nets, copper scales, and stories told in whispers. Wealth moved in silence here, cloaked in wool and pearls, carried across ledgers instead of lances. Power did not roar, it rearranged itself. Behind every mask was a hand adjusting something. In the great chambers of the Doge's palace, gold leaf glittered beside cold law. And in the alleys of San Polo and Cannaregio, the same language that sold pepper could dissolve a dispute before it began. Venice played every side and declared none. Her loyalties shifted with the tide, and her beauty was designed to distract from the bargain being struck in the shadows. This was Marco's inheritance before he could walk. His world was one of thresholds and half-truths, of cargo tallies and foreign syllables. He heard his father's voice in fragments, names of cities where the coins bore different gods, where the wind smelled of almonds and dust. He learned early that fortune arrived not in thunder, but in timing, a ship ahead of a storm, a word spoken to the right captain at the right dock. At home, maps curled like sleeping beasts. In the corners of the room, candles burned beside little stacks of cloth and stone and spice, objects that had traveled farther than any member of his household. In this quiet glow, Marco came to understand. Value was not in what something was, but in what someone believed it to be. The city shaped him slowly. He watched, not with reverence, but with precision. He saw men change languages mid-sentence. He saw ships sail in under one flag and leave under another. He saw silence used like a lock, and compliments deployed like keys. These were not lessons written in books. They were learned at the pace of tide. Venice did not raise him as a warrior or priest. It polished him, smoothed the rough edges, taught him to read the tone behind a greeting, to spot weight hidden beneath embroidery. Before he ever left its harbors, he had already studied the world through the lens of a place that never chose a single face. He didn't belong to one version of the city. He had absorbed them all. Marco was not born into certainty. He was born into absence. By the time he first opened his eyes to the filtered light of Venetian courtyards, his father was already gone. Marco Polo, merchant of Venice, was somewhere far beyond the Adriatic, riding east alongside his brother Maffeo, two men who followed the scent of silver and promise through lands most in the West still spoke of in legend. They were not warriors, but they moved through empires like ghosts, unnoticed until it was time to trade. Their departure had not been marked by fanfare. There was no proclamation, no grand farewell. Just the quiet boarding of a ship on the lagoon and the steady pulse of the oar as it carried them out to sea. Their path led first to Constantinople, a city of iron gates and gilded domes, where the Latin Empire had faltered and where Venetian ambition still clung to the ports. But the Byzantine court, ever shifting, grew inhospitable. The brothers withdrew with what coin they could salvage and moved north, across the Black Sea to Soldaya, then inland toward the markets of the Golden Horde. Their maps became vaguer, their hosts stranger, the laws less familiar. And yet they kept going, along the Volga, through Sarai, into the domains of Mongol Khans. At every turn they bartered, not just goods but reputation. They carried little, but what they carried mattered. Fine cloth, polished words, knowledge of weights, languages, and lines drawn on parchment. By the time they reached Bukhara, they had stopped being Venetian entirely. They were simply men of passage, adaptable, quiet, observant. In Bukhara, modern-day Uzbekistan, then part of the Chagatai Khanate, they stayed longer than planned. The city was a crossroads of sand and script, where Persians, Turks, and Chinese met in tea-houses thick with stories and dust. For 3 years they lingered there, stranded not by hostility but by opportunity. It was there that a message reached them, an invitation, or perhaps a command. Kublai Khan, ruler of the Yuan Dynasty and heir to Genghis, wished to receive envoys from the distant Latin West. No Christian priest, no crowned monarch had managed to reach his court. But these two merchants, unarmored, unheralded, would go. Perhaps it was their obscurity that granted them passage, or perhaps the world had simply turned upside down, and they had learned how to walk on its ceiling. They reached the court sometime around 1266, 6 years after they departed from Venice, having crossed deserts where camels sank up to their knees, and rivers that moved like ink across the steppes. There, in the presence of the Khan, instead of tribute, they offered curiosity. The Khan listened. He questioned them about the Pope, about the kings of Europe, about the God who died on a cross. And then he sent them back, with nothing but a letter, a request for 100 learned men of the West, and for oil from the lamp that burned above Christ's tomb in Jerusalem. The brothers turned west again, their satchels filled with parchment and memory, and somewhere between the mountains and the sea, Marco, still a child, was waiting for a father he had never met, a man shaped by passage, long roads and language, a man whose footsteps had never stopped long enough to leave prints, only a direction. The house in Venice was filled with corners, rooms that narrowed in strange ways, hallways that hummed with draughts and silence, windows that didn't open, yet always breathed salt air. Marco learned early to move through it without making sound, not because anyone demanded it, but because the stillness seemed to listen. His aunts and housekeepers spoke softly. The fire was tended more than it was watched. His mother had died when he was still very young. Her name clung to a handful of letters, and the way his uncle lowered his voice when he spoke of her. In her place were stories, passed from room to room like folded linen, and always returning wrinkled with another version. He knew his father's name before he knew his father's face. To Marco, Niccolo lived in the words of other men, in tales half told over fish stew or behind a door left ajar after the evening bell. He had crossed frozen rivers where no horses could follow. He had eaten with chieftains and slept beneath domes of gold, or so they said. Marco never quite asked. The stories came to him uninvited, braided into talk of debts, spices and ships. Some were spoken as warnings, others like prayers. Over time they turned less into facts and more into tone, a kind of music the adults didn't realize they played. Books were rare, but there were scrolls, ledgers, diagrams. He would run his fingers over lists written in dark ink, not reading the words yet, but tracing the shapes. There was comfort in their order. He copied them into the ash of the hearth, rubbed them out with his sleeve, drew them again. Some days he would sit by the harbour and try to match the curves of hulls to the ones he'd etched into tile with a piece of broken chalk. He began to sketch routes on scraps of cloth, imaginary ones at first, winding paths through islands he made up, then real ones overheard from traders outside the spice market. No one taught him this. It was a kind of listening that found its shape in lines. He didn't yet dream of adventure. He dreamed of arrival, of the moment a name was recognized in a city he had never seen, of walking into a room and knowing, before anyone spoke, which face was the one to greet first, of offering something, a phrase, a token, a joke in the right dialect that made the stranger pause, then smile. He imagined letters tucked into belts, words carried between ports like seeds in the hem of a traveller's coat. He didn't want to conquer the world. He wanted to slip into its shape and find where his own edges fit. When Marco was 15, the quiet came to an end. The door opened, in a pattern unrecognizable to Marco, not gently like from a housekeeper, or brute-like of his aunt, but with a sound that seemed to pull the whole house inward. No dream had prepared him for the faces that entered. His father, Niccolo, was thinner than Marco expected. His eyes moved with constant calculation, as if still scanning the corners of a foreign hall. His uncle, Maffeo, smelled of wool, tanned leather, and the faint sweetness of dried fruit. Their robes were not Venetian, and their voices carried accents Marco didn't recognize. And though they smiled, something in them felt paused, like men still traveling, even as they crossed their own threshold. They brought gifts, small, strange things. A robe embroidered with dragons that shimmered like scales in firelight. A flask of oil sealed in wax and marked in 3 scripts. Coins that bore no European king. Marco held them all with fascination, but also unease. These weren't heirlooms. They were assignments, tokens of a world he had not chosen, and that now expected something from him. Niccolo did not ask how Marco had grown, what he liked, who had raised him. He asked if Marco could write clearly, if he could ride, if he understood Latin and could mimic French. Questions delivered not as curiosities, but as necessities. His father had returned home, but not to rest. He had come back with a purpose, and Marco was part of the plan. At the center of it all was a scroll, long, narrow, wrapped in red cloth. The seal had been broken on the journey, but the parchment was still intact. Kublai Khan's letter, not a royal decree, but a request. 100 scholars, fluent in Latin and the scriptures, were to be sent east. They were to bring the oil from the lamp at Christ's tomb in Jerusalem, a symbol of knowledge, of light passed between worlds. But no scholars had come, and no priests had answered the call. The Pope had died, and Europe had wavered. Only the Polos had returned, not triumphant nor welcomed. Just back. Venice did not even know what to make of them. Rumors circled that they had betrayed Christendom by consorting with heathens. Had they truly reached the Mongol court, or had they spent 2 decades in hiding, trading with pirates in the Black Sea? The city that had taught Marco to observe now gave him no clarity. The brothers were treated with caution, curiosity, and quiet distance. No one celebrated. The gifts they brought were admired, but never embraced. The East, in Venetian imagination, was profitable, not respectable. And now Marco's family had brought it home in their clothing, their language, their posture. In the evenings, Marco sat at the edge of candlelit rooms, while Niccolo recounted their journey, not to entertain, to prepare. "The world is wider than your tutors can tell you," he said once, "and the road is more patient than the sea." Marco said little. He listened, but differently now. These were not tales passed around hearths. These were instructions, unfinished paths waiting to be walked again, by someone younger, someone untested, someone who had no choice but to inherit a mission given not by family, but by empire. When Marco looked at the scroll, he no longer saw parchment. He saw distance, a distance he had not chosen, but that now pulled him forward with the gravity of a promise made in his name. He did not yet know what it would mean, only that the world had opened a door, and his father expected him to step through it. The decision was not a ceremony. It was barely a conversation, short and final. Niccolo sat at the edge of the room, fingers resting on the rolled parchment from Kublai Khan. "It must be us," he said. "The priest won't come. The papal seat is still vacant. We know the road." And the Khan asked. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Across the table, Maffeo merely nodded. Marco, just 17, said nothing, but his heart beat louder than the silence. The air in the room changed, not with awe, but with friction. He'd imagined this moment for years, but not like this. There was no farewell feast or blessings, no saints invoked. Only 3 men and a promise passed between them, one written half a world away. And so, they left Venice with little more than what could be stitched into belts and saddlebags. The merchants who had watched the elder Polos return with strange gifts now turned their backs. Their wealth had come from places they did not name. Their journey eastward was treated like a superstition, something unsettling. But the Polo household did not wait for applause. They moved. By ship, they crossed the Adriatic to the Levant, a coast already thick with contradiction. Acre, last outpost of Christian power in the Holy Land, was where the real departure would begin. The city clung to the edge of the sea, like it knew its days were numbered. Fortifications loomed over winding markets. Crusader flags fluttered above alleys where Arabic and Italian tangled mid-transaction. The streets were never quiet. Armor clanked beside prayer chants. Pilgrims kissed relics while spice merchants haggled over saffron and cloves. And among them, the Polos, unmarked, unheralded, moving like men in search of a door they alone could see. They stayed in the merchant quarter, rented a cramped space above a cobbler, and waited. For horses, for letters, for the road to shift open. It was in Acre that Marco saw the world widen. He saw it in the details, in faces and gestures. A Greek trader with blue glass beads threaded into his beard. A Coptic priest with ink-stained fingers who whispered warnings about the journey through Persia. A Mongol envoy who never removed his gloves, even in the heat. Marco didn't just listen now. He started asking, bartering for information. He watched how silver changed hands and what questions made men go quiet. He discovered that every route came with a cost, and that maps were just suggestions drawn by the hopeful. The trio travelled light, with letters of passage from the Khan, and a small chest of gifts to the Khan. Not valuable, but symbolic. They avoided the sea and turned inland, toward Armenia, toward the Zagros, and toward the heat that clung to bone and winds that erased tracks by morning. At Acre, Marco had stood at the threshold. Now he stepped over it. He didn't feel brave, though. He felt awake. With each mile eastward, the world he knew loosened its grip, like water poured slowly from a familiar cup. They rode with monks who spoke of prophecy, with traders who carried news of bandits, and with guides who demanded coin for answers. The journey offered no welcome, only terrain and consequence. But Marco found rhythm in the strangeness. He learned when to speak, when to disappear, when to pretend he had seen something similar once before. His father taught with gestures more than words. Maffeo corrected only when it mattered. The world was no longer a story to be received. It was something to be survived, traced, repeated, and already changed. The land turned hard, rigid and full of certainty. The road east from Armenia led them into a world stripped of softness, where the hills lost their green and the wind picked up the taste of iron. Dust clung to the tongue, and the sky, broad, pale, unblinking, offered no comfort, only surveillance. Persia did not welcome. It revealed. Slopes gave way to flats, then to folds of gravel and bone. They passed salt lakes that seemed to hold no depth. their surfaces crusted like old wounds. Villages thinned into way stations. Names shifted with each tongue that spoke them. And through it all, the road remained, marked only by fire. And with just a flicker on a ridge, it had started, a single flame burning in a circular tower, unshaken by wind. Then another, and another. These were the altars of the Zoroastrians, guardians of an older worship, one that saw divinity not in temples but in elements. The fires were never extinguished. They burned through night, through sandstorm, through rain and ruin. Marco watched them from afar at first, uncertain. He had heard of these people, the Magi, from merchants in Acre, those who didn't carve idols but tended to flame. The priests wore white. Their temples smelled filled the air with ash and myrrh. And inside, silence did not reign. Recitation did. In the town of Yazd, they were granted shelter in a merchant's compound. There, for the first time, Marco was brought to the base of one of these fire temples. The outer walls were scorched but standing. The doorway was flanked with carvings of winged figures and bundles of reeds. Inside, a narrow stair led to the chamber. The priest did not speak. He gestured, and Marco followed. At the top, the air changed. It gained focus. The flames sat in a basin of hammered bronze, its light steady, its smoke drawn upward through a carved chimney of stone. No incense or chanting, only the sound of breath and fire sharing the same air. It wasn't mystery that filled Marco. It was precision. Reverence as function, faith as discipline. He asked questions quietly later. One trader told him the world had once begun in flame and would end in it too. Another claimed the fire was not God, but the eye of God, eternal, watchful, judging. In a bazaar north of Kerman, a woman selling dyed wool said the flame carried prayers upward because words were too heavy to rise on their own. Marco listened as he sought to understand why no one argued about it. The belief didn't demand conversion, it only demanded awareness. And so he began to see patterns, the way thresholds were swept, the way water was poured, the way the sun was acknowledged at dawn without fanfare. Nothing flamboyant, everything arranged. Between towns, the desert ruled again. They passed the ruins of palaces sunk into the dust, columns without ceilings, reliefs worn down to gesture. Marco would dismount sometimes, press a hand to the stone, and try to feel its weight. But the stone had already let go. One night, in a valley of black rock, they camped beside what had once been a fortress. Maffeo found a carved inscription, unreadable, smoothed by time. Niccolò said nothing. Marco stayed up late sketching it by firelight, copying the curve of each letter. He couldn't translate it, but wanted to remember the shape of something someone once wanted remembered. By the time they reached the plateau that led toward the Helmand, Marco stopped asking what lay ahead. The land had taught him that expectation was a Western luxury. Here, one arrived, or one did not. What mattered was endurance, attention, and grace in small gestures. He had not learned the rituals of the Zoroastrians, but he had learned their posture, upright, steady, aware. And that was something he could carry. Before dawn the climb had begun. Ice clung to the edges of the mules' harnesses. Stones cracked under hoof. Wind poured off the slope like a river reversed, cold, fast, merciless. The sky was too near, too bright. Clouds didn't drift here. They hung, as if trapped in a snare of peaks. There was no trail, only an instinct, a sense that if they kept their shoulders squared to the ridge and their breath shallow, they would crest something that might let them live another day. The Pamir Mountains were unbendable. They broke. Ridges jagged like shattered bone, valleys that held no echo. Even the birds, when they appeared, seemed lost, thin shadows against a sky drained of warmth. Marco had never known a cold that didn't end with a fire or a thick wall. This cold was permanent. It settled into the nails, behind the teeth. Even talking became a luxury, and laughter a risk. Sound travelled strangely. Hooves barely made a mark. Their Mongol guide, a man of few words and unguessable age, muttered only when danger was near. Falling rock, snow-thinned ledge, wolves. At the highest pass they stopped. Not by choice, by necessity. The animals refused to continue. Even the air seemed to resist movement. The sun sharpened everything it touched. Ice crystals, dry skin, exposed cloth. And below them, far below, lay a world that no longer felt real. Flat land had become memory. Marco stood apart from the others for a moment. He did not think about Venice, nor maps, nor the cities he had read of. He thought only of descent, of warmth, of how one could love something as small as a cooked root if it meant survival. They slept in a cave blackened by old fire, the kind used by shepherds or fugitives. The wind clawed at the entrance, but the stone held firm. Inside, Maffeo boiled water with bitter herbs that tasted like ash and copper. Niccolò's hands trembled while he tightened a saddle strap. No one spoke of glory. No one spoke at all. Marco tucked his feet under a pack and pressed his back against a wall that gave no heat, only solidity. He was not becoming a man here. He was becoming less protected, less certain, less removed from the raw mechanics of staying alive. On the fourth day, a storm caught them. Snow, then hail, then silence again, but the kind that warned rather than soothed. The trail disappeared. The guide moved with growing doubt. They sheltered beneath an overhang of ice-crusted rock. Maffeo bled from a split lip. The mules foamed at the mouth from altitude. It was Marco who found the detour, a narrow downward cut between two slabs. He had no name for it, no logic, only a feeling that something opened there. He called out. They followed. The slope held. On the far side of the ridge, colour returned. Slowly. Lichen, smoke in the distance, a cluster of goats. Then one morning stone homes built without mortar, domed, low to the ground, designed to hold warmth the way some vessels hold memory. A family took them in. No words exchanged, only nods, bowls of thick milk, strips of dried meat laid gently on a wool blanket. Marco didn't ask for names. He learned what mattered, how to warm frozen fingers in ash, how to greet an elder without offense, how to step across a threshold without dragging snow with him. He did not write these lessons down. He wore them, carried them in his knees, in the cracked skin of his knuckles, in the way he no longer flinched when wind found the gap in his cloak. The mountains had stripped him, but not broken him. He had passed through the cold, not untouched, but aware. They didn't know they had crossed the border until the rules changed. No guards waited at a gate and no lines carved into stone. But the people began to look different. Heavier furs, polished bows, strange embroidery in tight geometric patterns. The land grew flatter and faster. Riders moved like wind but without dust. Campfires stayed low to the ground, ringed with felt. And in every village, someone was waiting before they arrived, as if word of their journey had travelled ahead of them, not by letter, but by rhythm. At a river crossing, they were met by a party of mounted men, faces unreadable, weapons visible but untouched. The leader, broad-chested, his armor quilted and dyed in earth tones, looked at Niccolo, then at Marco. He spoke quickly in a language they did not yet know. A translator stepped forward. "You are expected," he said. "Food is prepared. There will be questioning." It wasn't a threat nor a welcome, but a statement. They were escorted to a camp large enough to hold 1,000, laid out with purpose. Yurts aligned by wind direction, fire pits dug at the precise depth to draw smoke away, water brought in by leather bags from a spring Marco never saw. It wasn't crude or even makeshift, but engineered, a moving city, ready to vanish or expand. Inside the largest tent, they were made to sit cross-legged on rugs stiffer than they looked. Dishes arrived: fermented mare's milk, sliced lamb, pressed cheese wrapped in leaves. No one explained what each was. The food was placed, and they were watched. Marco hesitated. Maffeo tasted first, and Marco followed. The milk was sour and strange, but clean. The lamb cooled quickly, and the cheese crumbled like chalk, but warmed the mouth. Only once they had eaten did the conversation begin. A scribe was summoned. He sat beside the host, but recorded nothing, only nodded. Marco noticed how often questions were followed by pauses. He didn't know when to answer. At one point he replied too quickly. The host's eyes narrowed. The scribe tilted his head. Niccolo stepped in, softened the tone, offered a correction, and the moment passed. Hospitality here was exact, a science. Shoes off, hands open, never point, never raise your voice. Marco learned this not through instruction, but by mistake. He reached for a bowl out of turn, and a child nearby flinched. He bowed too low and was laughed at gently. But he was not punished. He was absorbed, nudged into the current. And that night, he stood outside the camp where the stars scraped the sky. A flute played somewhere beyond the firelight. 2 riders returned with something wrapped in hide, meat or message. A woman boiled tea with something that smelled like bark and wind. Marco watched the shadows shift, but felt no fear. Not because he was safe, but because he was being studied just as closely. The next morning, they were led to a post station, a relay point of the Mongol Empire. The station keeper greeted them by name. Their mounts had already been prepared. Fresh horses, a sealed scroll from another camp they hadn't seen, a sack of rice, 2 flasks of liquid soap, and a finely braided cord. No one explained why. No one even asked for coin. The system moved without spectacle, where authority didn't dress in gold. It moved in efficiency and in timing. Riders changed every 20 miles, and messages were carried faster than rumor. By the second day, Marco realized the empire wasn't a place, it was a pattern, and he had entered it. The first thing Marco noticed was the grass, taller than he expected, brushed gold at the tips, swaying even when the wind was still. It was the summer of the year 1275 when they arrived, when the court gathered in Chengdu, known in whispered Latin as Xanadu, the seasonal capital of the Mongol emperor. There were no walls or moats or even battlements here, just long avenues of silk tents, their ropes fastened to bone pegs, their awnings painted in patterns that pulsed in sunlight. Horses grazed between banners. Musicians rehearsed near pavilions stitched with scenes from older campaigns. And at the center of it all, a compound of white stone and polished wood that gleamed as if carved from ice itself. They didn't have to knock. They were received, expected. stepped down from their mounts into a cool silence broken only by birds and the distant sound of drums marking the hour. Servants in robes of teal and saffron moved without announcing themselves. Nothing here was rushed, and yet everything responded, as if pulled by a thread unseen. Marco followed his father through a tiled courtyard where the stones were arranged to reflect constellations. The floor beneath his feet told stories he could not yet read. Every corner turned into another. Every archway framed a new geometry. This wasn't display, but design. The summer palace had been built to cool the body and widen the mind. Shade was engineered, light was invited, and fragrance came from flowering vines that crept down from trellises strung above the central walkways. Somewhere nearby, a tiger growled once, low, disinterested. Marco said nothing, but he slowed his steps. Kublai Khan was not here. Not yet. His court moved like tide, present in form, absent in person. The Polos were given chambers inside a guest hall flanked by silk partitions and polished ivory screens. They were not called for dinner that first night. They were left to adjust, to be softened by the heat, the rhythm, the expectation that understanding would not be offered, only earned. 3 days later they were summoned, not to the emperor, but to the road. The court was shifting to Khanbalik, the northern capital, future Beijing, where the Khan held audience in marble halls laced with thundercloud motifs. A royal caravan was forming of over 100 carts, 200 horses, a dozen officials, and even 6 astrologers. The Polos were placed near the center, not honored, but observed. The journey there took 2 weeks, across flat rivers and sudden hills, past rice fields threaded with dragonflies. Marco rode with a translator named Llewellyn, a man who had studied Latin from Syriac monks and spoke it with strange lilt. In this land, he said, we build to be remembered, but we travel to be changed. Khanbalik was not a palace. It was a logic. Streets ran straight as thought. Walls rose clean from their base, wide enough for 5 horsemen to ride abreast. Watchtowers looked in both directions, inward for danger, outward for ambition. There were canals inside the city, garden courts arranged by planetary influence, bridges of lacquered pine that sang under the weight of wheels. The air was cooler. The people wore deeper colors, black and crimson with threads of gold stitched only at the collar. When the Polos arrived at the south gate, no soldier saluted, no bells were rung. A monk in blue robes unrolled a scroll and studied their names, then simply gestured. They were allowed in. Not because they had earned it, because someone far above had already decided they would. Inside, Marco felt the rhythm shift again. Here, nothing swayed, nothing drifted. The world he had entered in Xanadu had danced like a breeze, but Khanbalik stood like a verdict, and somewhere inside it awaited the man who ruled both. And he did not arrive with trumpets, no procession, and no gold-chased litter borne on the shoulders of slaves. Kublai Khan entered the audience hall through a side curtain, walked to the dais in silence, and sat without speaking. The room shifted around him, of course, not in fear, but in recalibration. 1,000 feet adjusted their stance. Fans stopped mid-motion. One scribe dropped a brush. The sound it made, a soft tap of wood on lacquer, was the loudest noise for several seconds. Marco stood near the rear, just close enough to see the angle of the Khan's spine. Upright, but not rigid. Regal without performance. He had imagined a conqueror, a man built like a fortress, shouting in commands, surrounded by trembling underlings. But Kublai did not raise his voice. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was with the cadence of someone measuring not just words, but time itself. His Mongolian was slow, deliberate. His Chinese, perfectly enunciated. And when he asked a question, it was never about what one had. It was about what one knew. The first audience was informal, an observation. Even the Polos were summoned, bowed, and said nothing unless prompted. Kublai addressed Niccolo in Persian, asked about the Pope, about the Latin states, about the shape of European swords. He nodded when answers pleased him, but he smiled only once, when Maffeo recounted the route they had taken through the Pamirs, and how their mules had nearly frozen mid-pass. "The mountain does not bow," the Khan said, and then waved his hand, ending the exchange. In the days that followed, Marco saw more than he expected. He did not dine with the Khan, but he watched him dine, behind a screen of carved jade, seated with generals, scholars, and Buddhist abbots. The table was arranged in concentric circles. Closest to Kublai were those of highest favor, and the outermost edge held foreign visitors and silent princes from distant tribes. The hierarchy did not need explanation. It was visible in the seating, the cut of each robe, the weight of each silence. In one ceremony, Marco saw Kublai in full court regalia. A robe woven with a cloud and dragon motif that shimmered even in shadow. His belt held no sword, only a jade seal and a folded strip of silk embroidered with sacred characters. The entire hall bowed in a single motion, and Marco, slow by half a breath, felt his uncle's fingers press against his spine to push him lower. Later that night, Niccolo didn't scold him. He simply said, "The floor remembers who hesitated." The emperor didn't rule from a throne. He ruled merely by presence. His court functioned like an extension of his thought, multilingual, multi-ethnic, simultaneous. Decrees were dictated in 4 languages. Tributes arrived from 11 directions. He consulted Taoist mystics and Muslim astronomers in the same afternoon. A Buddhist nun once passed him a note during a policy meeting. No one flinched. No one questioned her right to do so. Marco heard stories whispered among the attendants, that the Khan had dreamed of a white falcon days before the song surrendered, that he once sat unmoving for 6 days until a rebel general turned himself in, that his voice could calm earthquakes. These were not courtly exaggerations, they were belief structures. The emperor's myth was not built above his rule, it was fused with it. In Kublai's presence, Marco felt no invitation, only gravity. This was not a man to impress. This was a man to orbit. One afternoon, during a formal review of maps and census rolls, the Khan looked directly at Marco for the first time. "You speak several tongues?" he asked through an interpreter. Marco bowed. "Enough to be misunderstood in all of them," he replied. A few scribes chuckled. Kublai's lips did not move, but he did not look away. It was not praise, not yet, but Marco would later say that this was the moment something shifted, that from that day on he was no longer just the son of Niccolo. He had been seen, not as a Venetian, not even as a Christian, but as a useful voice in the machinery of empire. One more language in the room, one more pair of eyes to send outward. He would come to call Kublai not just emperor, but teacher, not just a ruler, but a mirror. And even years later, long after the palaces had faded into memory and the audience halls were far behind, he would describe the Khan's gaze not in terms of authority, but in temperature. "He looked through you," Marco once said, like water cooled by a mountain stream. You didn't burn, but you changed. He was not chosen with ceremony. There was no scroll, no proclamation. One morning he was simply handed a message pouch and told which direction to ride. A minor governor had asked for clarification on a tax dispute in Yunnan province. The Khan's advisors had written a reply. Marco was to deliver it and observe the court that awaited it. That was all. The horses were prepared before dawn. His translator, a stocky man named Batu with a tattoo of a falcon's wing on his wrist, said little. "You carry the Khan's trust," he muttered as they mounted. "That means you will be listened to, not obeyed." Then they rode. No formal position had been granted, but Marco knew what this meant. He was now part of the imperial machinery, one more voice folded into the whispering lattice of the Mongol administration. A courier, a guest, a foreigner, and yet, increasingly, a participant. He carried no badge. The pouch was authority enough, and so he travelled as emissary, not envoy. His letters bore no seal of his own. His name was known only as an extension of the Polos. And still, doors opened, gates lifted, courtyards emptied before him, not because he was Marco, but because he arrived on horseback with the air of imperial business. And what perhaps surprised him most was the calm, the absence of trumpet blasts, no kneeling masses. Governance here did not announce itself. It functioned. Officials greeted him with quiet nods, scribes copied his letter with soft brushes, and meals were offered as matter-of-fact courtesy. No feasts, no riddles, just obligation met. But beneath that calm ran something deeper, a code. He could feel it even when it wasn't spoken. Bow too quickly, and you revealed anxiety. Too slowly, and you disrespected the host. Offer the wrong proverb when entering a hall, and conversation might stall for hours. He made mistakes. Batu corrected him, sharply at times. "Watch not the man," he said once. "Watch the room around him. That's where his rank lives." In the second month of his service, Marco was asked to report on the state of roads in the southern prefectures. He catalogued river crossings, courier posts, and border stations. He noticed which bridges were newly reinforced, which had prayers carved into their rails. He noted which towns flew banners of silk, and which flew linen, a subtle sign of wealth. He learned to write these details without judgment. The court did not want his opinion. It wanted his eyes and observations. He grew fluent in how information moved. A rumour told to a butcher in one village might reach a magistrate 3 provinces away by morning, if you knew which routes the traders favoured. He saw how grain shortages were addressed by tax reductions before revolt began. He watched how Mongol governors were rotated every few years, even when they were popular, to prevent loyalties from hardening. It was empire as balance instead of spectacle, but not all was logic. There were moments Marco could not explain. A white-haired woman stopped their caravan one afternoon near the Hexi corridor, and without a word, offered a basket of pomegranates and a folded ribbon. Batu accepted both with grave formality. "It is luck," he said later. "You do not refuse luck from the old." Marco wouldn't ask further. He began to dream in new languages. Scripts he couldn't yet read flowed in his mind like rivers, curling around familiar words and turning them into riddles. His sleep grew thinner, his posture straighter. He no longer flinched when someone called his name with a Mongol cadence, he answered. And still, he was aware, always, that he remained a stranger. He bore the gift of proximity, but not belonging. He was trusted, but never embraced. Respected, but never fully explained. Even Batu, who travelled with him for nearly a year, once said, "You are like a kite, tethered to a thread that no one here holds." Marco didn't argue. He only smiled, because the sky was still open, and the road kept pulling. The heart of the empire did not beat in a single hall. It moved through corridors, across tables, beneath lacquered beams and stone thresholds, an unseen current beneath the surface. Marco soon learned that there was no one place where decisions were made. There were chambers of finance, chambers of rights, chambers for salt, for grain, for dreams, and all of them operated in coexistence. Each morning, a bell sounded from the southern tower. 2 tones, a pause, then 3. That meant reports were due, so scribes emerged from dormitories, scroll cases in hand, escorted by assistants balancing ink trays and silk-bound records. Marco followed Batu into the Hall of Harmonies, where complaints from the southern provinces were reviewed alongside tribute schedules from Korea and Mongol troop rotations in the western steppe. And again, no voices were raised. They didn't need to be. He began to see the structure, subtle, architectural, not rigid, but reinforced. Decisions were made by alignment. A fiscal proposal might be weighed beside an eclipse report. A water canal permit could be delayed by an outbreak of locusts 100 miles away. The state did not rush. It coordinated. Marco at first misunderstood the pacing. He asked why a merchant license had not been approved after 3 sessions. A clerk looked up from his brush, unamused. "It is being remembered," the man said. "That is faster than it sounds." Marco did not ask again. He attended meetings, at first seated in shadow, then nearer the center. He observed patterns, how each official wore colors indicating rank, but also domain. Green for agriculture, white for court rituals, red only for the astronomers. Their hats curved at precise angles, their boots creased at identical heights. Uniformity without dullness, a fabric of functions. One day, a man with a scar across his neck stood to recite a weather report, not read, recited, by memory. He described rainfall in the north using metaphors from the I Ching. Marco leaned forward. The man paused, adjusted his sleeve, and continued. No one interrupted. The court valued fluency over speed. A metaphor was not decoration. It was record. It wasn't until the Mid-Autumn Festival that Marco was invited into the seasonal bureau, one of 4 rotating teams who adjusted policies based on wind patterns and labor flows. He was asked not to speak, but to transcribe. He copied grain tallies, drought forecasts, and festival expenditures. His brushstrokes were clumsy at first. A senior clerk adjusted his wrist without comment. After 2 days, he was no longer watched. And then came the unexpected. A paper, soft, square, scented with something like cinnamon, was placed on his desk. It bore no header, no seal. It was a petition from a widow in Shandong. Her son had died in transit under the banner of imperial service. She asked for his debt to be forgiven. The margins held annotations in 3 hands. A final note was written in precise red. "Will the Venetian assess?" Marco paused. This was not storytelling. This was weight. He asked Batu what to do. "Read it again," Batu said. "And remember, you are not judging a life, only how it was seen." He answered with care. He noted the dates, the trade route, the boy's age. He referenced a prior case 2 years earlier. He folded the paper 3 times and returned it. The widow would receive the pardon. No one thanked him. That wasn't the rhythm here. As the weeks passed, he began to understand the logic of it all, not as a scholar, but as a guest who had been offered the house key and told nothing about the furniture. Everything had its place, its cycle, its material. Even the ink was seasonal, darker in spring, paler by winter. Marco didn't question it anymore. He adjusted his grip. The empire did not dazzle now. It functioned. And somehow, in all its vastness, it made room for him. They told him the empire had edges, that it ended in jungles too thick for horses, in mountains with temples that bent toward the sky. They told him there were rivers so wide they shimmered with 2 moons, cities where the roofs were hammered copper and the dogs wore bells, villages where men wrote nothing but remembered everything. Marco heard of these places, and then he was sent. Kublai's court dispatched him south and west, toward the tributary realms. Not alone, never alone, but as part of rotating inspection parties, travelling with scribes, translators, guards, herbalists. In 1 month he crossed the tea hills of Yunnan, where the air smelled of moss and roasted bark. In another, he descended into the humid lowlands of Burma, where elephants were led through streets painted with lime and pigment. His reports were collected in packets of thin paper, bound in silk cord, passed to riders who galloped north without waiting for reply. He entered cities that didn't speak the emperor's tongue, but bowed to his seal. In Lijiang, a governor offered him candied citrus and asked questions with his eyes. In a mountain pass near Tibet, he spent the night in a monastery where the monks chanted without pause for 9 hours, eyes closed, voices cracked. No one told him why. No one explained. The reverence lived in repetition, not reason. What struck him here most was the variation. Each province bore the mark of the Khan, his banners, his tax agents, his messengers, but none had become him. In the southern jungles, customs officers wore earrings made of pearl. In the steppe-bordered markets, vendors arranged their wares in triangles, not rows. He learned to wait before assuming. A gesture that meant welcome in one court meant warning in the next. He ate with his left hand when offered a copper bowl. He declined a second cup of tea in a hall where 3 was considered greed. Every day became a choreography of precision he hadn't rehearsed. He once asked a local official in Kunming what united them all. The man smiled. "Salt," he said, then walked away. Another time, in the marshes of Sipsongpana, an elder woman told him, through a weaver's apprentice, that the empire was like cloth. The thread, she said, comes from one place. But the color? The color is ours. Marco took notes, endlessly, on goatskin scraps, on the back of trade receipts, in the corners of his memory. He described bridges made of living vines, and courtyards tiled in carved bone. He wrote of lords who bathed in milk, and priests who wore mirrored masks. Some things he only whispered to his translator at night, unsure whether he had truly seen them. Not every journey was smooth. In the hills near Dali, a road gave way after heavy rains. Their caravan was stalled for 3 days, surrounded by stone-faced guards who spoke no dialect Batu could translate. They were not hostile. They were waiting for a spirit to pass. No one explained what that meant. They waited, shared dried plum, watched the sky. When the rains ended, the soldiers disappeared without a word. There were stories, too, that no map could contain. In one town, the people told of a king who had vanished into the river and returned a year later with silver eyes. In another, a wandering doctor displayed a creature's tooth the size of a man's fist, claimed it belonged to a lion that wept. Marco learned to write these tales as he heard them, without judgment. The court didn't require belief, only record. And then there were the things he never reported. A ceremony under moonlight, where dancers wore robes soaked in dye and moved as if pulled by unseen wind. A fire that burned blue without fuel. A boy who spoke to him in Latin, flawlessly, then vanished into a field of bamboo. When he returned to Kanbalik, his skin was darker, his sleeves stained with dust and resin. He had acquired a cough that clung to him through winter. The scribes asked for specifics, routes, prices, formalities. He gave them everything he could, and kept the rest. There was a rhythm to the empire's reach. It did not need to conquer what it could illuminate. The provinces obeyed not because they were crushed, but because they were seen, counted, allowed to echo themselves beneath the wide sky. And Marco, now, had seen the edges, if they could be called that. Marco had never felt heat like this before. Not from sun, not from flame. It rose from the ground, thick and slow, the kind that lingered behind your knees and clung to your collar. In Shanxi, the kitchens used black rock, chipped by hand, stored in baskets beside the hearth. It burned longer than wood, gave off no scent. And when he asked the cook where it came from, the man blinked once, then said, "The mountain, the one that smokes even when it rains." The rock was coal, and it was everywhere. It powered the furnaces where iron was softened. It warmed the tiles of bathhouses in cities too vast to memorize. It was stacked behind inns, beside government stations, loaded into wheelbarrows and pulled by oxen. To Marco, it had the feel of something secret, but no one treated it that way. This stone was used with indifference, like a fact too old to notice. That made it stranger. One evening he saw a potter fire 30 bowls in a single round. The flame roared low and blue, barely rising past the rim. "Without coal," the man said, lifting a shard to inspect it, "the glaze changes." Then he turned away. No sermon or marvel, just method. It was in cities like Kaifeng and Chengdu where the unfamiliar deepened. Sent to observe tax transfers, he expected silver bars, bronze weights, crates of grain. Instead, clerks handed over folded slips of mulberry bark, stamped, inked, and countersigned. Money, but made of paper. He held one too tightly once and was warned, "The ink is still wet." The slip was worth more than the silk tunic he wore, yet it bent in his fingers like leaf skin. He asked a scribe if it could be forged. The man nodded. "Of course, that's why we track them." A drawer opened. Inside were 6 ledgers, each no thicker than a thumb, each more precise than law. He was shown the codes, the watermark, the seasonal dye pattern. The currency changed color every few years. "A river cannot be trusted if it does not move," the scribe explained. Marco recorded the facts. But what stayed with him wasn't the currency itself, it was the confidence. Shops displayed prices with no coin in sight. Paper passed from hand to hand like promise incarnate. No one weighed it. No one tested its edge with teeth. A seal was enough. He visited a marketplace in Hangzhou where the scale of things unmoored him. 10,000 residents, they said. He doubted it, then someone corrected him. No, that was the street. The city held more than 1 million. Marco walked its bridges, its corridors of lacquer and lanterns, and felt his vocabulary curl inward. There was nothing in Venice to compare. On one corner he saw a child purchase steamed dumplings with a slip no larger than a prayer ribbon. On another, A foreign merchant from Samarkand exchanged 5 notes for passage permits and grain. The transactions were swift and silent. The paper, soft as thread, disappeared into sleeves without flourish. There were rumors, of course, that the Khan's reach could summon a letter across 1,000 li in less than a week. That code was hidden in the way seals were cracked, that some riders could mimic a man's voice so well his family wouldn't know the difference unless they looked up. Marco didn't chase the truth. He watched how people behaved. A banker in Luoyang burned a forged note in front of a client, bowed, and issued another. "Trust isn't the paper," he said. "It's the hand that accepts it." In one village, a woman asked Marco if people in Europe used feathers for money. He laughed, said no. She looked disappointed. "That would be lighter," she said, and turned away. By the end of that season, Marco stopped converting values and exchange rates in his head. He no longer thought of coins or ducats. What mattered was what things could do, what heat they gave off, what path they unlocked, who they could move across borders. Coal burned, paper traveled. Value in this world had texture, but not always weight. And somewhere in the distance, more roads waited. Roads marked not by empire's roar, but by how quietly the next messenger would arrive. He had seen the empire's foundations, its coal and paper, its horses and stamps. But even in those offices of logic, rumor moved faster than reason. Between one post station and the next, someone always leaned in and whispered about places further south, lands where men grew to the height of trees, where horses spoke in dreams, and where the Khan himself once sent envoys who never returned. The stories changed with altitude. In the mountains near the southern border, Marco was warned to travel only by daylight. "Beyond the 7th river," a herder said, "the ground walks on its own." When Marco asked what that meant, the man wouldn't repeat it. He only touched the blade at his side and turned his eyes toward the trees. Later, in a tea house near Tali, a merchant swore he had seen a giant, 9 cubits tall, with a voice that made birds fall from the air. He drank sour milk and sold copper bells. "The giant lives in a cave that drips with light," he said. "Sometimes he eats men, sometimes he gives advice." Another man listening from the next table laughed. "That's just old Lou. He's tall, but he limps, and the light is salt from the roof." Marco didn't argue. He wrote nothing that day, but he kept hearing things. A village elder in the jungle said the emperor once sent gifts to a tribe of dog-headed people who danced with fire. A guide described a plain where the ground smoked and birds refused to land. Others spoke of mountains filled with ghosts who had lost their tongues. And then came the beast. It was outside a provincial court in Bengal, tied by a thick hemp rope to a carved wooden post, grey, thick-skinned, horned, but with folds like armor and eyes like burned glass. "Unicorn," the stableman said, proud. "Caught last spring." It grunted once, flicked its ear and relieved itself with remarkable force. Marco stared. It was no unicorn. It had no elegance, no shimmer, and its horn sat above its nose, dull and cracked. The creature pawed the ground, then leaned sideways against the post as if bored of the whole performance. He asked what it ate. "Anything," they said. "Mostly turnips." He made sketches, took measurements, wrote down the word rhinoceros, though he wasn't sure that name fit. It didn't matter. The court official stamped the report. Verified. That night Batu said quietly, "It's better when people don't believe it." the story lives longer. They continued south, crossing wet lowlands and river deltas. In one village they were offered a meal of stew, so dark and thick that Marco could not identify the meat. He asked. The host smiled. It was not one of us. Batu declined his portion. Marco forced 2 spoonfuls down. The flavor was sour, faintly metallic. He said nothing afterward. 3 days later they found a pair of shrines made of skulls and painted gourds. No signs, no monks, no inscriptions. Just a line of fruit left at the base, and a silence in the trees that made even the birds cautious. They didn't camp nearby. In the court record, Marco listed isolated spiritual practices, possibly shamanic. He avoided the word cannibal, but it followed him anyway. Everywhere they went now, there were tales he couldn't verify, but couldn't dismiss. Women who never aged, men who grew a second shadow during eclipses, lakes that hissed when approached. He tried asking for details, and the villagers shrugged. It is like that, they said. In his journal, Marco created a section titled Accounts Unconfirmed. It grew faster than the rest. One entry simply read, a blind boy who painted birds that only flew at night. No one else saw them, but the paintings disappeared. By the end of that leg of the journey, Marco had stopped sorting fact from marvel. He recorded the stories as they came, filtered by fear, translated through barter, warped by the thrill of being listened to. And in time, he began to realize, wonder was not always a lie. It was sometimes a direction, a pressure, a need to make the world match the size of its hunger. He didn't see any giants or monsters, no men with the heads of dogs, but he carried their shadows in his notebooks all the same, because someone had seen them, and sometimes that was enough. The story was never told once. Each version shifted, bent by tongue, distance, intent. What Marco wrote down was already 3 steps removed from the thing itself. A word for sacred in one dialect meant untouchable in another. The phrase for man-eater might refer to a beast or to a king known for cruelty. Even simple nouns betrayed him. The term for horn used by a hunter in Yunnan meant spirit protrusion to a priest in Sichuan. Both pointed at the same beast. Neither agreed on what it meant. Sometimes the errors were innocent. He once translated a phrase meaning soul painted in air as sky dance. It became a kind of flying monk in the later versions. Other times, it was the fault of his guides, eager to impress, quick to embellish. A city said to have golden walls turned out to be clay dyed yellow at dawn. The towers shimmered, but only once. And sometimes, Marco let it happen. He didn't correct Rustichello when he called the fire worshippers sorcerers. He didn't explain that the unicorn had calluses on its feet and terrible breath. He left the painted skulls in their shrine without interpretation, just noted them, and turned the page. It wasn't that he meant to deceive. It was that certainty had stopped being useful. The world had shown him too many shapes, and language, even at its best, was a rough tool for wonder. So he wrote, and let the words shift behind him. They waited 3 days before they were summoned, not out of disrespect, but because the moment mattered. An audience with the great Khan was never denied, only timed. Marco had known this might come. Kublai was aging. His eyes still burned with calculation, but his body moved slower, and the court's rhythm had begun to shift. New voices gathered at the edges of power, some Mongol, some Chinese, some watching Marco a little too long before speaking. Change was in the air, thick as varnish of the walls. When the call came, They were brought through the west corridor of the palace, quieter than usual, its carpets refreshed, its guards in ceremonial form. The air smelled of red pine and horse oil. At the final door, they were asked to leave their blades, their boots, their pouches. Marco obeyed. So did Niccolò and Maffeo. Not a single word passed between them. Inside, Kublai sat on a low dais, draped in indigo silk, the colour of autumn skies and settled power. He stayed seated. He looked tired, but not diminished. "You have served me," he said. No flourish or title, just the truth. He spoke of letters delivered, roads crossed, governors placated, reports written. He named cities Marco had barely remembered, and others that still lived behind his eyes. He recalled a treaty Marco had brokered without realizing it, a grain quota renegotiated by his quiet suggestion. "You have walked more of this land than most of my generals," the Khan said, "and you remembered what you saw." Then he paused. "You may go." It wasn't dismissal, it was release. The Khan knew they intended to return west, and because he knew that time moves in circles, and even long roads must fold back. Still, there was silence, and then he added almost gently, "The Empire will not stop, but neither will it wait." Marco bowed, lower than he ever had, out of respect, yes, but also of admiration and gratitude. They were given another scroll, not a letter of passage this time, but a farewell, sealed with the Khan's mark and written in 4 scripts, a gesture of respect or a tool for safety should politics shift after they were gone. They were offered gifts, cloth, jade, rare resins. Marco chose nothing. Niccolò accepted a lacquer box. Maffeo nodded once and asked for horses. Outside the palace the light had changed. The sky was brighter, but it felt colder. The city buzzed, unaware that their departure would not be announced. And yet, somewhere in that lattice of memory and rule, a page had turned. The boy who had once stepped off a boat in Acre now stood beside his father and uncle, wrapped in the sombre blanket of farewell. The ships they were given weren't Mongol, but belonged to a coastal prince allied with the court. Large, wide-bellied vessels, their decks patched with unfamiliar timber, their rigging taut as bowstrings, the polos boarded without ceremony. The harbour air tasted of brine, mould, and rusting iron. Their cargo included porcelain, spices, and a princess promised to the Persian crown. She did not speak to them, and the sea did not wait. From the first night, the wind strained against them. Sails snapped like whips, and rain came from every angle, cutting sideways through rope and skin. Marco stood on the upper deck once, and felt the whole world roll beneath him. He lost the horizon, lost north, lost the distinction between sky and water. Only the mast remained, black and vertical, as if the ship had been nailed to the storm itself. 3 weeks in, the sickness began, first among the deckhands, and then the rowers. Saltwater sores and fever and blackened gums. The physicians used vinegar and prayer. It changed nothing, of course. One man leapt into the sea during a calm morning. No one followed to help. No one spoke his name. The princess's chamber was sealed after her attendants began coughing blood. They lost a ship near the Nicobar Islands, a reef or bad judgment or something else. 1 minute it trailed behind them, the next it was gone. No wreckage was found, only the silence on the horizon. At anchor off the coast of Sumatra, they waited for repairs, and traders came with coconut wine and dried fish. Marco sat on the shore and watched a child scale a tree with nothing but his heels and fingertips. The air was thick with insect noise and wet bark. He wrote nothing that day. Maffeo bartered for new sails, and Niccolo cleaned wounds with hot salt. Marco learned to climb the rigging blindfolded, a wager made during a windless spell, and he won barely. The princess, when next seen, was thinner, but unbroken. She carried herself across the deck with her veil lifted, stared at the stars, and said something to the moon in a language Marco did not recognize. He wondered what she feared more, the sea or the land that waited. When they set sail again, the moon followed them, round, silent, and watching. The winds had calmed, but the silence felt less like peace and more like memory. They buried the captain 2 weeks later, wrapped in a silk map they would no longer need. No prayer was spoken. There was no time. They crossed into Persia again with different eyes. The ports had thinned them. Illness had taken the cook, a translator, 2 guards, and 3 men whose names Marco had never fully learned. The surviving crew moved without chatter, like oars left soaking too long in salt. Marco's boots were stiff with dried sea stain, and his writing hand had begun to ache. The inland air felt sharp after months of damp. In Hormuz, they hired new mounts and turned north. The familiar road stretched ahead, though it no longer felt like something known, only something survived once, and now approached again with caution. The people here remembered them. Some greeted them with nods, others only stared. Time had not stood still in their absence. Borders had shifted, and the faces at the checkpoints were new. One garrison captain studied their scrolls longer than necessary before waving them through with a half-curious grunt. They travelled faster this time, out of instinct and routine. The work of wonder had faded. They no longer needed to stop and question local customs or sketch temple roofs. They only looked for shelter, clean water, and safe passage. That was enough. In Yazd, Marco passed the fire temple again. The same flame, or one replaced to look like it. He didn't go inside this time. He just stood in the courtyard, felt the warmth against his knuckles, and moved on. Somewhere near Tabriz, they received news of the princess. She had been handed safely to her betrothed. There was no ceremony announced, just a statement of fact from a merchant they met at a way station. He said her wedding procession had included silks from the east and a single white falcon. Marco wondered if she would ever feel the winds of ocean again. In the mountain passes, snow still lingered at the edges of stone. Maffeo slipped once, cursed loudly, then laughed harder than he had in months. Niccolo's hair had turned fully grey. At night they boiled tea and said little, a mix of anticipation and anxiety in the air as they got closer to the Latin world. Marco wrote in the dim light. He had stopped organizing his notes. Some pages were now nothing but fragments. Smells, overheard jokes, the weight of coins in new hands. Crossing the Black Sea, the wind turned cold again, of course, and not the cold of mountains at least, but the thin kind, the one that comes before cities. By the time they reached the edges of the Latin world, their silence grew heavier than the distance behind them. They were no longer the men who had left, and they knew the city that waited would not recognize what it had returned. As they entered Venice, 24 years after they first departed, they noticed how little had waited for them. The canals were the same, but the faces had changed. Their ship entered the lagoon under a low, slate-coloured sky. No crowds waited and no signals were sent ahead. They docked like traders returning from an ordinary route, quiet, stiff from travel, eyes scanning rooftops for familiarity that did not return their gaze. Venice had moved on, and the neighbors had forgotten. The family name was still known, but dulled, like a coin rubbed smooth. The house had been rented, and the ledger books were gone. Eventually, a cousin recognized Niccolo, offered a strained smile, and asked if they were back for good. No one asked what they had seen. Their riches puzzled the officials. Jewels from Java, carved boxes from Burma, documents in Persian, Mongol, Chinese. Some were taxed, some were confiscated, others were ignored. The Venetian merchants who had once whispered curiosity now whispered suspicion. Too much time had passed. Marco walked the Rialto and listened to dialects that had drifted since his childhood. He tried to order food from a vendor and was misunderstood. He tried again, slower, and the man responded in broken Greek. He was home, yes, but he did not belong to it anymore. Rumors bloomed as they did the last time his father had returned, that they had consorted with sorcerers and that they had traded souls for silk, that Marco had married a Mongol princess, or that he had never left at all. He did not correct them. The scroll from the Khan remained unopened, although the seal had cracked in the humidity somewhere near Trebizond. Marco kept it anyway, as a relic of authority that no longer carried weight on this side of the world. At night, he unpacked his notebooks. Some pages were unreadable, damaged by sea spray or careless folding. Others felt like messages from another version of himself. He didn't organize them, and oftentimes, he didn't try. Weeks later, a letter arrived from a Genoese contact. A war was brewing again, and Venice would need men. Niccolo and Maffeo declined, old and tired. They had traveled far enough. Marco accepted, because a city that did not remember him would at least remember his capture. And in a prison far from the canals of his youth, he would finally begin the tale that no one had asked for, but that would outlast every forgotten greeting. It was near Curzola that the world he carried was torn apart by war. The Adriatic foamed with broken wood and banners soaked in brine. Venice and Genoa, twin mirrors of ambition, had turned to cannon and oar. Marco, no longer young but still marked by the long road east, sailed aboard a galley thick with the smell of pitch and sweat. He wore no armor. Perhaps he carried a blade. But if he fought, it was not with the fury of youth, only with the cold rhythm of someone who had long since learned to endure. When the ship went down, there were no witnesses who remembered him clearly. Some said he leapt into the water. Others said he was dragged from the hull half-drowned. Either way, he survived, and Genoa took him. It wasn't a cruel prison, but it was neglectful. Thick walls, damp straw, a narrow slit of sky that changed little with the hours. He was not interrogated, not mistreated. He was simply kept, a name recorded in a ledger, a man tucked into forgetfulness, except he wasn't alone. His cellmate introduced himself with a bow that nearly tipped over his stool. Rusticello of Pisa, former knight, sometime courtier, and author of tales filled with Arthurian valor and dragons with jeweled tongues. He had been captured during an earlier conflict, and seemed in no hurry to leave. When Marco told him where he'd been, the Pisan stared, then laughed, then reached for his inkpot. "You've brought me an empire," he said. "Let's give it teeth." They fell into rhythm quickly. By day they shared food and silence. But in the evenings, Marco spoke, sometimes in slow clinical detail, grain measurements, customs duties, postal distances. Other times the memories came like floods, temples of gold, fire worshippers beneath a turquoise sky, beasts with a single horn and skin like hammered iron. Rustichello wrote everything down, and when Marco paused, the Pisan filled the gaps, adding flourishes, metaphors, titles. A modest hunting lodge became a fortress of marble. A clever merchant turned into a baron. A ghost story whispered in a market square stretched into a prophecy. Marco tried to correct him at first. Then he stopped. Not because he had given up on truth, but because truth had begun to bend under its own weight. The more he told, the more he remembered, or imagined, or both. The stories had lived in his mind for years, scattered, worn, folded. Now they were gaining spine. They called it Il Milione, perhaps for the tales it held, or perhaps for Marco himself, who was already being called Marco of the Millions by skeptical gods who teased him for every fresh wonder he described. Still, the book grew. Rustichello structured it like a romance, not a travelogue. It began with the court of the Khan, wandered into deserts and jungles, circled through marvels both plausible and impossible. There were empires where paper bought grain, where coal burned cleaner than wood, where messengers outran arrows and kings ruled by silence. There were cannibals, fire-breathing bulls, priests who floated, cities where the roofs glittered like night seas. Scribes copied pages by hand. Fellow prisoners passed around excerpts. A visiting notary requested a full reading. A Genoese admiral took a copy to Cyprus. And still, Marco added more, not to boast, but to remember, and maybe, to anchor himself to something no prison could take. When peace came, he was released without ceremony. He returned to Venice, quieter than before. Older again, but not finished. He opened a warehouse and managed trade goods. Rarely spoke of the Khan. But the book travelled. It passed into the hands of monks, navigators, princes. It was translated, misquoted, rewritten, challenged, adored. Some called it a lie, others a masterpiece. Some copied it into the margins of sea charts. One young navigator would carry it aboard his ships as he chased a western route to the east. Il Milione did not build walls, or raise armies, or crown kings, but it changed how the West imagined the world, not through certainty, through wonder. And wonder, it turned out, was harder to destroy. The first question was simple. Had he really gone? Even in his own time, there were doubters. Clerics in Paris, merchants in Bruges, courtiers in Naples. Some read Il Milione and frowned. The world Marco described was too large, too strange, too symmetrical in its marvels. Cities built with mathematical precision, postal systems without delay, a court more refined than any in Europe. They looked at Venice and saw no sign of the man who had walked beside the great Khan. His family had not gained titles. He had not returned with an army, and there was no parade. And the book, rich in colour, dense with detail, had too many shadows. No mention of tea, no careful account of temple bells, nothing of calligraphy, or the binding of feet, or the Great Wall. Glaring absences, some said. Impossible oversights, others insisted. Why name so many minor cities? And omit the symbols that defined China. Perhaps, they argued, he had never reached the court. Perhaps he'd stayed in Persia, heard stories, copied reports. Perhaps Rustichello had invented more than he admitted. Some pointed to the tone. Marco did not describe the Khan's court as barbaric. He praised it, sometimes even admired it. For a Christian from Venice, that was suspicious. In later centuries, theories multiplied. One scholar claimed Il Milione was a translation of older Persian documents. Another argued it was a merchant's fantasy, real places, filtered through rumor and the need to impress. A few insisted Marco had been there, but only briefly, and that the book was a patchwork built afterward, stitched with flourishes to fit Western hunger for the exotic. There were forgeries and new versions, altered maps, copies with added monsters and extra kingdoms. Each made the truth harder to find. And Marco? He barely spoke. In the rare records of his later years, he speaks more about warehouses than about the Silk Road. But on his deathbed, when asked to recant, to admit exaggeration, he refused. "I have not told half of what I saw," he said, as a clear factual statement, because perhaps he hadn't. Not just for lack of time, but because some experiences resist translation. Some distances cannot be flattened into ink. Some truths are carried not in detail, but in how they shift your understanding of the world. He had tried to show a West that was still medieval, a glimpse of something more intricate, more networked, more fluid, more advanced than it wished to believe. And in doing so, he left a record that was both mirror and mirage. Was it entirely true? No one knows. But it was believed. And sometimes, that is what history remembers, just like his guide Batun had said. The book outlived them all. Kings faded, roads crumbled, the Mongol Empire fractured and scattered into sand and script. But Il Milione remained, copied by monks, translated by scholars, scribbled into margins by boys with globes and salt-stained fingers. It became a kind of relic, not of empire, but of perspective. Columbus carried it across the Atlantic. Jesuits brought it to Beijing centuries after Marco had left it behind. Cartographers argued over the lands it described, mapping its cities beside the real and the imaginary without distinction. In some editions, its marvels swelled. In others, they were trimmed down. But the core endured, a Venetian voice describing a world Europe had not yet dared to imagine. It wasn't just a travelogue. It was a mirror, and what the West saw in that mirror wasn't always the East, but itself, refracted, stretched, challenged. The book was never static. Over time, it became a dream atlas, a place where truth and metaphor wandered side by side, where mountains glimmered with prophecy and bureaucracy shared space with beasts, where memory blurred into vision and observation hummed with myth. Even today, no one can say with certainty what parts are real, which are echoes, which were inventions born from misheard words or moments lost in translation. But that ambiguity was its strength, because Il Milione offered not proof, but possibility. It asked its readers to widen their map of the world, to accept that there were civilizations older, richer, and more complex than anything drawn in the Latin imagination, that silk and stone and song could weave empires as real as steel, that a man from Venice might walk through them, not as conqueror, not as savior, but as guest. It's easy to question him now, to pick apart distances, point to the absences, to wonder if he embroidered his own legacy from the threads of a dozen stories. But beneath all the speculation lies something harder to fake. Detail without spectacle, admiration without conquest, curiosity without claim. Marco Polo never claimed mastery of the East, only that he had seen it, that he had tried to understand it, that he had carried it back, one word at a time, across borders and silence, into a book that would whisper across centuries. The man himself died quietly. his will survives. It lists items both grand and humble, brocades, coins, debts, a servant freed. He left no gold statues, no monuments, only a narrative, a glimmer. And it is that glimmer, not the certainty, that keeps him walking still across shelves and memory. Because stories like his do not settle into history, they continue. And so, the scroll is set down, the ink dries, the hoofprints fade beneath sand and snow. The voices of emperors and envoys, of merchants and mystics, fall quiet once more, but they are not gone. They settle back into the folds of the world, into the rustle of banners in forgotten cities, into the low wind that still curls through the ruins of silk roads and shadowed halls. The story of Marco Polo does not end. It lingers in the pages worn by centuries, in the wonder of a map not drawn, but imagined, in the fragile silence after the telling of a tale. Perhaps, dear listener, you feel it now, that hush, that subtle stillness of having wandered far. If you are still with us, thank you, truly, for choosing to drift through these long and distant roads with care. In a world that rushes past truth and wonder alike, you chose to pause, to listen, to walk slowly with a man who may have seen too much, or just enough to change how the world dreams of elsewhere. You have traveled with us through salt ports and fire temples, over mountains where breath fails, and through courts where history and myth shared a seat. You have stepped into the breath of the Khan, and the silence of returning home. These were not just memories. They were mirrors, reflecting both what the world was and what it believed it could be. In listening, you've joined a long tradition, one that keeps stories alive not by proving them, but by wondering at them. So, let us part gently. Let the lamps burn low in Venetian windows. Let the step winds settle and the stars resume their quiet watch above roads now empty and cities long vanished. The names Marco, Rusticello, Kublai, they all rest now, but they are never far. They wait in the sound of distant bells, in the crease of a map never finished, in the stories we carry when we return home changed. Sleep well tonight, and may your dreams drift past the edges of certainty, into places lit by lanterns, filled with silk and silence, and always, always, just beyond the horizon.